All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what is happening at this moment in the Ukraine war, we're being joined by Professor Peter Kuznick, who's a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University. He's joining us live on this broadcast. Now, Professor Kuznick, thank you very much indeed, sir, for taking time out and speaking to us. And let me, in fact, start off by asking you this. Now, this is a very crucial phase of this war. And besides the obvious problem of ammunition, Ukraine seems to be bothered with a much bigger problem, and that is of manpower. And now there are reports that are coming forth that there are a lot of Ukrainian soldiers who are also deserting and just fleeing from their positions. Do you think there's anything that the West can actually do to try to make good on the desertions that Ukrainian army at this moment is witnessing?
Well, the French in particular have talked about sending French troops to Ukraine, but that would be very, very dangerous and unpopular in France. There's nothing that the West can do to replace Ukrainian troops who are deserting in very, very large numbers. The estimates are that at least 100,000 Ukrainians have already deserted, and that number might be as high as 200,000. You combine that with the number of Ukrainians who have left the country, somewhere between 10 and 20 million have left Ukraine, and you put that together with the fact that the latest polling inside Ukraine shows that a majority of Ukrainians would rather end the war and give up land that the Russians now control rather than continue the fighting. So I think what we're seeing is an across-the-board demoralization or a recognition that this is an unwinnable war. And that to continue fighting, to use these young men and older men as cannon fodder, just to be put out to be slaughtered. The Ukrainians, the soldiers themselves, don't want to be in that position. And I think most Ukrainians now realize that this might have been a gallant effort, but it's no longer worth continuing.
You know, the morale within the Ukrainian army could be low because of the desertions that we are looking at, but the morale in the White House does not seem to be low at all, even though Joe Biden is counting out his last days as the lame duck president. Now, what we've been witnessing the last couple of weeks is that he has sanctioned the Ukrainians to go ahead and use long-range weapons to strike targets inside of the Russian territory, for which the Russians have responded by saying that, listen, we can hit back with much greater force. In your assessment, what do you think is Joe Biden's strategy as he counts out his final days at the White House here?
I don't think that Joe Biden is lucid enough to have anything we would call a strategy anymore. What he's trying to do is give Ukraine as much weaponry and as much money as possible before Donald Trump takes over. He wants to box Trump in as much as he possibly can, but is using the Ukrainians as, you know, the cannon fodder for that effort. And I think the Ukrainians have had it. In the United States, there's a growing weariness, as there is in Europe, with continuing to fight a war that is futile. Not only futile, the Russians have already won in every meaningful sense. The Ukrainians are outmanned, outgunned, outmaneuvered. So what we're left with is a tragedy of people giving up their lives or their limbs for something that they know they can't win. It doesn't make any sense.
But if you look at what the decision makers in the White House seem to be at this moment talking about, if you were to go by that report that emerged in the New York Times, where it said that one of the officials perhaps indicated to Joe Biden that the United States could give nuclear weapons to Ukraine for long-term credible deterrence against Russia, so that Ukraine does not have to suffer the fate that it currently suffers. Do you think the United States at all would consider giving the Ukrainians any kind of nuclear weapons, as was indicated in that New York Times report, which happens to be a paper of record for the United States?
Well, you have to remember that report came out 8 days ago, and that paragraph, one paragraph, was buried at the end of a long article, and the sources were anonymous, because nobody in their right mind would consider giving Ukraine nuclear weapons at this point. I mean, we're talking about weapons that the Russians would never tolerate, that the Russians would destroy before they were usable, and that would, if anything, likely trigger a nuclear World War III. Giving them the permission to use the ATACMS inside Russia, the Russians have responded with massive attacks, destroying Ukrainian infrastructure, the energy grid, but also with the Reshnik missiles. This is a hypersonic intermediate range missile that cannot be shot down. And they already destroyed the first targets in Ukraine, and they've got more and more of these that they can use.
Right.
And they have multiple warheads. They can actually carry nuclear warheads. The Russians signaled to the United States that they weren't going to use nuclear warheads, but Russia has also lowered its nuclear threshold.
Right.
They signed new nuclear policies that make it much easier, not only against Ukraine, but against any nuclear power that supports Ukraine in its attacks on Russia. And so the whole thing is, and even the American experts, when they announced the ATACMS that they're being used, the American experts all said, too little, too late.
Right.
So why should we risk nuclear war over a policy that we know is going to fail? That it's not going to make any difference on the battlefield.
I think you've summed it up very comprehensively there. We're completely out of time. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Kuznick, for joining us with that perspective there. For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.